Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister will address the House of Commons later this afternoon and hail a new sense of optimism in the Brexit talks. It follows that deal on Friday, which allows negotiations to move forward to discuss the future relationship between Britain and the EU. But the nature of that future relationship is likely to become the focus of fierce domestic debate in the coming weeks and months. The Cabinet will begin its discussions later this month. And further across the political spectrum, there is a wide range of opinion. David Davis said yesterday the UK government wants to secure a Canada plus free trade deal after the UK leaves the EU. Canada's deal with the EU eliminates 98% of the tariffs between the EU and Canada, without the country paying for access to the single market. But unlike the Canada deal, David Davis wants financial services, which account for a substantial part of Britain's output, to be included in the tariff-free area. But some Brexiteers are unhappy. Leave means leaves. Richard Tice says the government risks diluting or giving away the opportunities of Brexit. He says the UK should be forging new trade deals with third-party countries, deregulating EU laws and creating a fairer immigration system. Meanwhile, Labour's Brexit spokesman Keir Starmer says the UK should stay aligned to the EU after Brexit and could negotiate payments to access the single market as Norway does now. Asked if that would include allowing free movement of people, he said he would support an easy movement of people. The Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry raised the possibility yesterday that the UK could stay in a form of customs union after Brexit to allow trade to continue between the EU and UK. While the SNP have called on Labour to get behind them and commit to stay in the single market and customs union. Well, our political correspondent Chris Mason joins me now. So, Chris, sufficient progress was made on Friday, but there's an awful lot to get through before it's rubber-stamped this Friday.
Yeah. There is. So this morning, first thing was a cabinet meeting. There's only one more after today before the end of the year. And yes, there is that big discussion to come about the end state, exactly what the cabinet wants in terms of what the flavour of Brexit turns out to be once we have left in the end of March of the year after next. Then this afternoon, that appointment that the Prime Minister has in front of the House of Commons. She was hoping to have done it last week, before that aborted lunch of turbot with Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, and then a few days of frantic diplomacy and not a lot of sleep, and then that dash back to Brussels in the early hours of Friday morning. But a pretty triumphant tone, I suspect, from the Prime Minister this afternoon and from some around her, because it could have been very, very different, couldn't it? We could have either been talking today about how the whole thing had unravelled and gone pear-shaped and it was a nightmare for the Prime Minister, with all of the talk about what that might mean for her future or lack of it, or that there was days to go until the summit and a deal still hadn't been done and all that kind of stuff. Instead, the Prime Minister will say that, yes, we're going to have a game of Brexit bingo again. We're going to hear those phrases, hard and soft Brexit. Prime Minister saying it's not about either of those things. Our good old friend, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. But, she says, a new sense of optimism about the talks in the new year as discussion about the future relationship, trade and security and that kind of thing becomes the focus in 2018.
How is she going to keep everybody on board when everybody has a different view and opinion of what that end state, in terms of the future trade relationship, should actually look like? And also, tell us briefly about the EU withdrawal bill, which is back in the Commons.
Yeah, therein lies the challenge in terms of keeping everyone on board. I guess the flip side to that is that if you're in Downing Street, one thing you can marvel at in terms of the achievements of the other day was managing to come up with a document that Brussels was willing to sign off on, Dublin was willing to sign off on, Belfast, in the shape of the DUP, was willing to sign off on, and the various wings in terms of European instinct within the Conservative Party were willing to live with as well. Obviously, once we start getting into that discussion about the future relationship, and ultimately it boils down to, you know, how close or otherwise the UK in the future will be to the European Union, the other side of Brexit, then there is going to be a range of views and there's going to be a range of arguments, no doubt. As far as the withdrawal bill is concerned, agreement. That continues. It's trundling through the House of Commons. Huge amounts of detail to go through in terms of all of that. The government will hope that the prospect of any defeats there have been limited by something that falls into the category, I was told last week by one MP, of being important but boring, or boring but important. This is this whole business of the Procedure Committee and the proposed Sifting Committee. Bear with me, the idea being that there can be a lot more scrutiny of what are known as statutory instruments, some of the little tools that are being used to push through one heck of a lot of detail in that withdrawal bill.
Right, well, I'm glad you're across it all, Chris Mason. Thank you very much for joining us. Here in the studio is the Westminster leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford, and from Central Lobby, the Conservative MP, Bernard Jenkin, who was on the board of the official Leave campaign group Vote Leave. Dawn Butler and Andrew Mitchell, of course, are also still here. Ian Blackford, first of all, you have made a pitch to Labour to join you in committing the UK to remaining in the customs union and the single market. Why?
Really, because it's about protecting jobs and investment in the United Kingdom. We know that if we're out with the single market and the customs union, it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of jobs throughout the UK.
But why have you made this pitch now to Labour?
Because I think there's a growing concern as to where we may end up as we go into stage 2. And what I'm asking is Labour and the other opposition parties to get behind us, and also with Conservative MPs that have real concerns about being out with the single market and the customs union.
Right.
Nobody voted to be poorer. And what I would say to Dawn, what I'd say to others, is that we need to make sure that we protect the interests of our constituents. And that's why remaining in the single market and the customs union is so important.
Well, do you accept that overture from the SNP?
Well, I think the position that the Labour Party's taken from the very beginning has been right, and we've been proven to be right.
What is it? What is the position?
In regards to us having a transitional arrangement and transitional deal, and having a bespoke deal when it comes to the customs union. And I think sometimes we forget that because it was well over a year ago that Labour's position at the very beginning has been proven to be right. And if
my question is, are you accepting the SNP's invitation to stay in the customs union, the single market, and campaign with them?
Right, so I understand what Ian's saying, but the thing is, what that would mean would be you'll be ignoring the referendum. And the Labour Party has no intention of ignoring the referendum. But what we've said is that we need to have not only this transitional arrangement, but we have to have a way to maintain the benefits of the customs union and the single market.
So what's the difference? Well, but what's the difference between your position and the SNP's position? Because as you've just said, Keir Starmer also, we want to retain the exact same benefits as if we were in the single market and the customs union and remain in a customs union. So essentially, what's the difference?
So the difference is basically how we talk about it, in essence, in terms of we might not be able to say we are still in, but if we maintain the benefits, then, you know.
Right, so you're going to call it something different, but essentially it's the same.
It's not that we're going to call it something different, it's just that once you leave the European Union, you can no longer be a part of the single market as it is, because you would have left.
Do you see any difference between your two positions?
Oh yeah, there is, and I think we have to be very clear about the threat that there is to people, the threat to jobs, the threat to prosperity, as I said. Now the point about this is, what the Tories have talked about before is coming out the single market and the customs union. Labour have accepted that we need to have a transition deal. But the harsh reality is,
through
that transition deal, we are going to be in the single market and the customs union. The cliff edge still remains. What I'm trying to do is remove that threat that there is to jobs in Don's constituency, in my constituency, and up and down this country.
Right. Well,
nobody's voted to be poorer.
Right. Well, let's put you've just said that the government should expect to remain in the customs union, the single market, during their implementation period. Bernard Jenkin, do you agree with that? Is that your understanding?
Well, I'm listening with amazement, because the Labour Party actually stood on a platform at the last election that they respected the referendum result, which meant leaving the European Union, leaving the customs union and the single market. And they had some weasel words in their manifesto about trying to have the benefits of being in the single market and the customs union without actually being in it.
Right, so what's going to happen in the implementation period as far as the government's concerned?
What we're hearing now is actually the Labour Party has moved into a position they don't actually want us to leave the European Union. And the fact that Keir Starmer actually committed the Labour Party to a second referendum can only mean one thing: they're hoping to change the results. They're hoping to reverse the referendum decision. So the Conservative Party now is the only party, apart from the DUP, there are only these two parties in Parliament that actually want to honour the referendum result and deliver the freedom to control our own borders and stop contributing money to the European Union.
Dawn Butler, are you committed, or can you rule out that Labour would ever support the idea of a second referendum?
Can I just say, the problem with what's just said is that David Davis has admitted that he doesn't have to be very bright to do his job and to be Brexit Secretary, and I think that's fundamentally what the problem... Yes, he did, and I think that's fundamentally what the problem is, because you do not only have to be very bright, but you have to be across the detail.
Right.
And that's been the problem with this negotiation.
So answer the question
from
about
the very beginning.
Me the question about the second referendum. Is Labour going to support the idea of a second referendum?
That's not something that we are considering at the moment.
But you might.
But as Keir has said, there's nothing off the table, and it's a sensible approach to negotiations. And this is the problem that we've had with this government in terms of having red lines, and after a year and a half having to then row back because they hadn't considered the detail. And that's the problem.
Bernard Jenkins, how do you envisage Britain's future relationship beyond Brexit in terms of trade?
Well, actually, the idea that the Cabinet's never discussed any of this, the position was set out in the manifesto that we're leaving the EU, we're leaving the customs union, we're leaving the single market, and we're going to be in a position to do meaningful trade deals with non-EU countries. And that means we have to have regulatory autonomy, because most trade deals are not about negotiating about tariffs. That's the icing on the cake to get rid of the tariffs. Most trade deals are about dismantling the non-tariff barriers. Right, so you do want to see regulatory autonomy. Absolutely. How worried are you about the idea that if a deal isn't done, there will be full alignment of the UK being tied closely to the EU standards and customs in order to maintain that open border with Ireland? Well, we've clearly made a commitment to Ireland and to the EU that we want alignment, but every trade deal starts out with discussion about you've got to align with us and we've got to align with you. Right. The advantage of this discussion about our trade deal with the EU is we already have complete alignment, and the alignment in Northern Ireland is confined purely to the matters that pertain to the North-South cooperation and the support of the agreement. Right. In any case, this text will form part of a much bigger text, the withdrawal agreement, and it is the withdrawal agreement as a whole that will have legally binding effect. This text on its own has no legal binding effect. Oh, right. So this is a statement of intent, as David Davis said, which upset the Irish government. Well, I mean, I think the Irish hoisted the Jolly Roger and then had to pull it down again. Are you saying this agreement is not worth the paper it's written on before it's even been given? Well, you've just said it's not binding in any way. Well, it is an agreement to move to the main phase of the negotiations, which is long overdue. And the fact that the EU almost begged Theresa May to make an agreement, I think shows what a strong position the United Kingdom is in, and that we should stick to our guns. We should not finish up where Labour and the Liberal Democrats and the SNP now want this country to be. Right. Outside the European Union, unable to influence the decisions made, unable to influence the court, but subject to the court and all the rules and all the costs, and unable to do trade deals with the other countries outside the EU. Well, that's the worst of all possible worlds. Well, why is it that Richard Tice, then, from Leave Means Leave, says it's a total capitulation, this deal, that, in his words, the UK is paying far more that they're not actually legally bound to do in order to move on to phase 2, that they have signed up to an arrangement where the UK could be tied for a generation to the EU in terms of customs and in terms of standards. There won't be the divergence that you have talked about, that the European Court of Justice will have jurisdiction, certainly over the rights of EU citizens during the implementation period and possibly beyond. Do you regard that as a success? Well, that is not the government's position. Perhaps he's listening too much to the European Union and the Remainers and the SNP and the Labour Party. I thought you supported Leave Means Leave. I've never been, well, I am a supporter of Leave Means Leave, but I don't agree with Richard on this point. Right. Why not? I mean, in terms of you... If I can get a word in edgeways, yeah, go on then, please. You finish. Well, the point is, this is merely moving us to the next phase of the negotiations. We are now starting a free trade negotiation with the EU. As I say, both sides are setting out their positions on each side. There will have to be compromise, as there was compromise between Canada and the EU. But to finish up with a Canada plus and able to be able to do trade deals with the United States, or even be able to perhaps participate in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has been abandoned by the United States, which would welcome British participation.
All right.
You know, we've got huge opportunities, and we mustn't throw these opportunities
All right, let
away
me come to Andrew
by
Mitchell.
still being a prisoner of the EU.
Right. Do you think Britain is going to be a prisoner of the EU in the way Bernard Jenkins has outlined? Would you like to see the UK closely aligned to the single market and the customs union?
Well, let's be clear where we are today. First of all, we have reached first base successfully. We had a difficult week last week, but it ended with a triumph for the Prime Minister, and we can now advance towards the second phase. And my dispute with all my colleagues who've spoken on this programme so far is that I think they are slightly jumping the gun. I think the key thing is to get into these negotiations. Canada plus sounds to me like a very good starting point for the British negotiations. And at the end of the day, of course, we're going to have a transition period. Otherwise,
within the single market and the customs union?
A transition period we're going to have, otherwise business won't be able to plan and make the necessary changes that will be required. But the key thing to me is to let the negotiator, who is doing an extremely good job, get on with negotiating the best position for Britain.
Is that David Davis?
It is David
Dawn
Davis.
Butler said he's not very bright.
Well, I beg to differ.
It's his own words. It's his own words. It's his own words.
He's got a brain like a steel trap. He's extremely bright. But let the negotiator get on with negotiating the best deal for Britain. And that is not either a hard or a soft Brexit. It's the best deal for Britain, the whole of Britain, and that's what I now want to see us advance towards.
Do you see this moving on to phase 2 as a statement of intent? It's not binding in any way?
Well, certainly the principle that has been outlined is binding, absolutely.
Right, so you disagree with Bernard Jenkins there, that it's all up for grabs?
No, Bernard is quite rightly giving a technical appreciation, but what I'm saying is that when the British government put up that point, which secured agreement across the piece, that principle is certainly binding.
Do you see the UK's future relationship as one that will be closely mirroring the European Union in terms of rules and regulations?
I see the primacy, the absolute importance of a free trade deal as overruling all of that. That, by definition, means alignment to some extent, but a free trade deal is absolutely essential for both of us.
What, in your mind, Dawn Butler, does easy movement of people mean?
It means that some people are saying, well, are you signed up to no movement? No, we're not signed up to no movement. There has to be movement.
Sure.
And
but
so
an end to freedom of movement is what the Labour manifesto said. So what does Keir Starmer mean when he says easy movement?
Well, that is something that he will then develop in terms of detail. But the question he was answering...
so he hasn't actually thought through what this is.
The question that he was answering was, are we saying there's no movement? And Keir was saying that it's impossible to say there's no movement because we will need movement in people in order for us to...
Well,
for our
everyone's
economy
accepted that,
to thrive. So we will need movement of people, but it won't look exactly as it looks now. So there would be more stringent regimes around it in terms of how people are monitored.
Well, will there be a cap on numbers, for example?
Oh, we never talk about caps on numbers.
OK, so there won't be a cap of numbers. We'll have easy. Could it mean an unlimited number of EU migrants coming to the UK?
I think, to be honest, that's a part of the negotiation stance and details. If we were around the negotiating table, that we could come back with more detail. And that's the kind of questions that you really should be asking David Davis and the government in terms of what their plans are.
Do you see in Blackford in the coming months that actually Labour will move its position to saying we should remain in the single market and the customs union, and then the two of you can forge a closer relationship on Brexit?
Yes, that has to happen because it has to be about protecting the interests of our constituents. And
are you talking to Labour at the moment?
I wrote to Jeremy Corbyn yesterday, so I'm waiting for a reply. I've said that we should sit down and meet. But, you know, the fundamentals of this, if we're in a situation that everyone seems to accept that there's going to be alignment with the rules of the EU, the situation that we're in today is that there will be no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. We now know, on the basis of the intervention of the DUP, there's going to be no border between the island of Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. The only way you can square this is by staying in the single market and the customs union. The hard Brexiteers have taken the country up a blind alley and it hasn't worked. They're simply going to have to accept that staying in the single market and the customs union is the only logical way of resolving
Well,
this.
I mean, Bernard Jenkins, what you said, the final word, Bernard Jenkins, will you and do you still think Britain should pay for its obligations that it said it would honour, even if you don't get the trade deal you like?
Well, we have no obligations. We would like to offer the EU some money as a goodwill gesture for leaving the European Union midway during a budget period, and that's reasonable enough. But just two very quick points. There was never going to be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
Well, that's not what the Irish government thought.
Well, if they wanted to have one, that would be up to them. We were never going to have one. If they want to put infrastructure there, that's up to them. And actually, it would never happen. It was all a bluff. It was all a nonsense. And because you don't need to police the border at the border in order to police the border with technology these days. And the second thing about alignment. Alignment isn't a yes-no question. Andrew is completely right. In any free trade deal, there are degrees of alignment. The point is, under the new arrangements, when we leave the EU, we will control what we choose to align with the EU instead of being dictated.
Well, you say that. Well, we'll have to see. At the moment, it doesn't sound like that. It sounds like
well, that's your opinion, Joe. That's your opinion.
No, I think that's the opinion that has been expressed by many people, but the term was used.
Well, obviously you're on their side.
What, pardon?
You're obviously on their side.
Whose side?
Well, you said you agree with them.
No.
You just did.
No, I just said the view that was expressed. Anyway, we'll have to continue this another time. But Bernard Jenkins, thank you.
John. Last week's deal on the first phase of Brexit was good news for worried people on both sides of the argument, Theresa May has told MPs. And she has written a letter to all the EU citizens living in the UK, reassuring them that they will have their rights written into UK law after Brexit. But just how binding is the agreement? In Brussels, the European Commission spokesman said it was not legally binding, but a deal between gentlemen. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this.
Outside Parliament today, braving the sleet, some Stop Brexit campaigners. Inside in the warm, the Prime Minister was praised by both wings of her party for the divorce settlement agreed with the European Commission on Friday in Brussels.
This is good news for the people who voted leave, who were worried that we were so bogged down in the negotiations, tortuous negotiations, it was never going to happen. It's good news for people who voted remain, who were worried we were going to crash out without a deal. We are going to leave, but we're going to do so in a smooth and orderly way.
Theresa May put a message on her Facebook page addressing EU citizens living in the UK. She wrote, "You can now look forward, safe in the knowledge that there will be a detailed agreement on the table in which the UK and the EU have set out how we intend to preserve your rights. Have a great Christmas and a very happy New Year." But the Prime Minister's festive message emphasised the agreement was on the table, not signed, sealed, a 100% guarantee. And that was a theme Theresa May repeatedly returned to, defending her agreement. Here, asked in the House of Commons whether Britain would now honour the minimum £35 billion divorce bill in all circumstances.
This offer is on the table in the context of us agreeing the partnership for the future, agreeing the next stage and agreeing the partnership for the future. If we don't agree that partnership, then this offer is off the table.
The Prime Minister was answering Jeremy Corbyn, who said the government's position was chaotic and contradictory.
18 months on from the referendum result, the Prime Minister has scraped through phase one of the negotiations. Scraped through after 18 months. 2 months later than planned, with many of the key aspects of phase one still not clear.
And what about the promise of no hard border for Northern Ireland? The agreement suggests there could be alignment with EU rules to make that possible. But Mrs May today was telling Tory MPs the UK could go its own way after leaving the EU.
The Prime Minister seemed to confirm that she believes we will have full regulatory autonomy after we leave the European Union. Can she explain how that is compatible with regulatory alignment between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and no hard border?
We have said very clearly that we will avoid and guarantee that we won't have a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Within any trade agreement, there will be a decision taken as to those rules and regulations that we wish to, on the basis of which we wish to operate on the same basis, those areas where we have the same objectives but will operate on a different basis, and those areas where actually they are irrelevant to the issue of the trade agreement.
Even if they're baffled by that, some Brexit supporters might feel strengthened in their beliefs by Chancellor Merkel's words today. She gave broad backing to President Macron's call for stronger integration of the European Union. They want Britain to stay inside. Well, does the Prime Minister really want to rip this whole agreement up at some point in the future? Could she really countenance that? It's not completely convincing. I think what we're seeing to an extent is the fact that this whole divorce bill discussion has been a negotiation not just with Brussels but with her own side, and talking about the ability to take the deal off the table is perhaps an ongoing part of that negotiation with some people on her own side. What have we actually learnt here? I think one of the things we've learnt just today, watching people in her own party from both wings rallying round her, is that a week is a very long time in the political climate at the moment. Round about now was when Theresa May was coming back from Brussels with a collapsed deal only last week. She's not exactly triumphant at the moment, but she is spared. I think the other thing we've learnt is that Jeremy Corbyn is making it perfectly clear he's quite happy for the date of Brexit, March 2019, to slip if there isn't time to complete a negotiation by then. That, Theresa May, that date being in the bill that's coming back to the House of Commons tomorrow, was not something that Theresa May was ready to commit to today. You get the impression she might just pull that date out of the bill, but it clearly remains absolutely her determination to get there then.
Gary Gibbon at Westminster.
Now, Theresa May might be said to have saved her career with that last-minute Brexit deal she brought back from Brussels on Friday. Now, it seems she has saved the career of her deputy and closest political ally. We understand it'll be confirmed this week that Damien Green won't be sacked as first Secretary of State over those allegations about porn on his office computer. When I say we say it, I mean our political editorial person who has wandered in here this evening with this exclusive. So, just to be clear, he's been accused of a couple of things, so we'll maybe start at the basics.
Yeah, so there was a police investigation into a different matter in 2008 where the police uncovered porn, they say, on his computer. He says he didn't put the porn there. Nobody's alleging this was illegal porn, by the way, but it's all about effectively inappropriate use of parliamentary equipment, plus whether, in fact, he's lied about the fact that there wasn't porn there, or that it wasn't his porn. Now, Cabinet officers, I understand, it can't prove that it was him who put the porn there, was looking at porn. Secondly, and actually what started the investigation of Damien Green was a writer academic, Kate Maltby, made this allegation that, to use words that she chose when she texted a friend, that he hit on her. She was a sort of younger person looking for help, looking perhaps for a job. He denies all that. So this is a case of sort of he said, she said, although she says she's got sort of contemporaneous evidence of what she felt at the time. I think he would have been in serious trouble if another woman had come forward and alleged harassment or inappropriate behaviour. That hasn't happened. This Cabinet Office investigation has been going for some time. They've investigated, talked to lots of people. The investigation isn't completely finished, but I have talked to very highly placed sources who tell me categorically he will be told. He doesn't have to resign, and indeed the announcement, I'm told, will come on Wednesday. Huge relief for Theresa May. There is no minister closer to her than he is. He's effectively her number two. She's lost two other ministers comparatively recently, Fallon and Patel. A third would have been hugely damaging. So, as I say, I think it looks as though this key prop for her, Damien Green, is going to keep his job.
OK. She's having a good run, has to be said. Let's see on Wednesday. For now, Robert, thank you very much indeed.
If you thought voting for Brexit meant you'd hear no more about Europe, look away now, because there's still lots to talk about. First, this morning we still didn't know whether we'd really resolved phase one of the talks, the divorce terms. It looked sorted on Friday, then there were conflicting interpretations of what we'd all signed up to. That storm has been calmed. But then secondly, there's what to expect from phase two, the trade part of the talks. We know Britain wants a deep and special partnership with the EU, but quite what that will end up looking like, we don't yet know. This afternoon, the Prime Minister was in the Commons to show she could carve a path through phases 1 and 2 that will reconcile all competing views. Did she succeed? Nick Watt reports.
It's that chilly time of year when we are reminded of some eternal human truths. It's freezing out there, but in that blanket of snow, you can see uniformity or, on closer inspection, the endless variety of nature. In the new world of seemingly permanent protests, Tory MPs have been voicing widely divergent views on Brexit. But today, they spoke almost as one.
May I first of all congratulate the Prime Minister on her triumph last Friday.
Can I join my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Rushcliffe, in congratulating my right honourable friend in driving through an improved agreement on Friday against what many thought could not have been feasible.
Today really was an illustration of that old Harold Wilson cliché that a week is a long time in politics. So how did Theresa May go from humiliation in Brussels to widespread praise on her own benches? Well, the vast majority of Tory MPs want to give her space ahead of the EU summit in Brussels this week. I am also told that the crucial change in mood came over the weekend when Downing Street offered assurances to Eurosceptics on one of their main concerns from last week's deal with the EU. This was that the offer on Northern Ireland could be used to smuggle the UK back into the single market. They were told this was not possible for one very simple reason. If the UK crashes out of the EU with no deal at all, then the specific commitments on the Irish border will no longer apply.
The text of this agreement now makes clear that in the event of a deal, Northern Ireland will not be separated politically, economically, or by any regulatory requirements from the rest of the UK, along with the aim of no hard border on the island of Ireland. But in the event of no deal, no overall deal, nothing is agreed.
In Dublin, there was weary acceptance.
The reality is that at any point in this process, events could very well intervene and could, make the agreement politically impossible to deliver on. And I think that's the big risk with all of this. Genuinely, all parties entered into an agreement that is considered to be absolutely, ironclad. But in reality, political events in these uncertain times mean that nothing is really cast iron. It can't be.
This week's midwinter chill shows no signs of letting up. But Theresa May is benefiting from a thaw in relations within her own party until the next Brexit challenge arises.
All right, well, Nick is with me. So, Nick, this point that she managed to pacify this fear on the part of the Brexiteers that Ireland was going to put us into the single market by the back door, what argument did she actually use?
Well, there was obviously this hiccup yesterday when David Davis said that offer on the border was a statement of intent, and he said that was much more than a legally enforceable thing. Dublin took fright at that, so David Davis went on LBC today and he said, yes, of course I was saying it's a statement of intent, and that's much bigger than the law because we're good friends. And then he said, of course it's legally enforceable, but crucially, legally enforceable within the withdrawal agreement, in other words, Article 50. And I understand what that means, we were saying last week, is that the offer of full regulatory compliance with the UK, with those elements related to the Northern Ireland-Irish Republic border, that covers that third element, but within Article 50. But if there's absolutely no deal, if we crash out with no deal, then those arrangements do not apply, and at that point you are down to a bilateral undertaking between the UK and the Irish Republic.
We start again on that one. OK, so anyway, that's phase one. Storm over, everything's calm, which means we look forward to phase two. The whole thing moves on now.
Well, obviously we've got the European Council this Thursday and Friday, and we have so far the draft summit conclusions, and that is looking forward in two areas. Firstly, on the transition, the European Council is suggesting, the UK says it wants to be for 2 years, and the whole body of EU law would apply for those 2 years. The UK view is it should be an implementation period, and so yes, that body of law would apply for the beginning, but eventually you would begin to move away from it, and then the beginnings of the hints of the restrictions that the UK will seek to apply to the UK for the future trade arrangements, because the UK has decided to leave the customs union and the single market.
Council is the big thing this week. Thanks a lot, Nick. Well, let's assume the big European Council meeting goes well, that we do move on to phase two of the talks. Can't be stressed enough that this is the issue which will define 2018. So far, the British government has held its different factions together by them all adhering to the goal of building a deep and special partnership, a bespoke deal specially for Britain. Not hard, not soft, something different. It was set out in the Florence speech by Theresa May in September.
Let us not seek merely to adopt a model already enjoyed by other countries. Instead, let us be creative as well as practical in designing an ambitious economic partnership which respects the freedoms and principles of the EU and the wishes of the British people.
Well, everyone in the UK government can sign up to that. But, if you listen carefully to what the EU says, they think it's more binary. For our partners there, the basic choice is you're either inside the EU single market, like Norway, or you're just a so-called third country, like Canada. You can have a trade deal, like Canada, but that's a long way from where we are. Those two existing models keep coming up. Phrases from Michel Barnier on the single market, such as either you're in or you're out, or its integrity is non-negotiable, have been making this point. Or this.
It will not be possible to combine the benefits of the Norway model with the weak constraints of the Canada model.
Well, let's for a moment imagine the EU means that. What do these two options imply? You can think of them as two ends of a spectrum in which you choose access to the EU market or autonomy to set your own rules and regulations. Norway has lots of access to the EU market, but the condition for that is compliance with EU rules, including free movement, and paying in to the EU budget. For these reasons, Brexiteers and our government have ruled it out.
It would mean paying the European Union billions of pounds every year in perpetuity. It would mean following EU rules with no say over them. It would mean no divergence from EU rules in the future whatsoever. It would mean zero control of immigration. I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, that wouldn't make a success of Brexit. That would be no Brexit at all.
OK, well, if you don't like that, what about the Canada option? Now, here is the Canada deal with the EU. CETA, it is called, the EU-Canada Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. We're missing about 1,000 pages of annexes. Has quite a bit of detail. If you look, for example, I take a page 155, Article 20.12. This is about parties may make laws against camcording of movies in cinemas. That's the kind of detail it has. No one thinks you can negotiate one like this in a year, but you could kind of take this as the template, Tipex the word Canada out and replace it with the word UK. The advantage is we'd have more autonomy. This is the full English, proper Brexit. But on access to the EU market, it's not great for some of our key industries. And there is the fact that you may still need a physical border, and we pledge not to have one in Ireland. This Norway versus Canada choice is, though, how the EU wants us to look at the menu. They say we simply have to decide. But is it just possible we can get something better? That is what the government wants. Here's how David Davis described the trade deal the government's after.
An overarching free trade deal, but including services, which Canada doesn't, with individual specific arrangements for aviation, for nuclear, for data, a whole series of strands which we've worked out too. Most of them based on where we start now.
If the basic deal, I'm being very crude about this, but is Canada plus the city or something like
Canada
that?
plus. So what we want is a bespoke outcome. We'll probably start with the best of Canada and the best of Japan and the best of South Korea, and then add to that the bits that's missing, which is the services.
He clearly wants more trade access than the Canadians have got, but does he want to align with EU rules to get it? And will the EU listen? Certainly, they have offered special deals to other countries when they want to Ukraine, for example, and to Liechtenstein. All right, well, with me now are two experts on all of this. Charles Grant, Director of the Centre for European Reform, and Ali Renison, Head of Europe and Trade Policy, the Institute of Directors. Ali, Canada, which sectors, British sectors, if we went straight to the Canada deal as it is here, which British sectors would really suffer from that?
Well, I think actually when you look across the piece, the point about Canada is that it's effectively starting from a very different vantage point. So the market access is nowhere near. They do still have tariffs. They're not all eliminated. Agriculture would be particularly hit. Financial services and a lot of other basically services, professional services sectors whereby you would have to, under the Canadian deal, have a local office in a European capital to be able to really access those markets.
So it's really not, in access terms, I thought the goods makers, on the sort of the goods, I thought that it was mostly sorted out on that. It was just the services that were a bit of a hole.
Well, the difference there is that if you are, for example, in the automotive sector, you tend to rely on your ability. The Vehicle Certificate Agency can issue an approval for a car to be sort of sold and marketed throughout the entirety of the EU. So they have a sort of an agreement on what we call conformity assessment. You don't really have that same automaticity. And that's the big differentiator between the Canada and the Norway model, is you're not automatically downloading EU rules related to the single market.
So they're not downloading the rules, but it's not automatically acknowledged that their things are compliant with the rules. In terms of a border, Charles, what's the system? I mean, the Canadians have borders, presumably. It's just more or less like it is at the moment. You have to have a...
When goods leave Canada and come into the EU, they have to go through the customs controls on the edge of the EU's customs union, yes.
And so it doesn't help you at all on that, because a lot of people are saying, the Canada option will allow us to remove a physical border in Ireland, and
no, that's not right at all. Right. There is a border between Canada and the US. Although they're both in NAFTA, have a kind of free trade agreement, they still have border controls at the frontier.
So that's Canada-Norway. I think we've got the kind of gist of the difference. Canada plus plus plus. So this would be, what would be the plus 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 really if we went down that route?
So I think even though we're not talking about completely replicating passporting for financial services, it is something along those lines. Very often in trade agreements between different countries, they don't tend to include anything really substantial on financial services. You don't tend to have agriculture, for example, included in the Norway option. The EEA doesn't really cover agriculture, and obviously that's something that's going to be very critical to the Irish borders. So this is going to be different.
Right. Charles, do you think they will offer us something in the middle? They keep saying it's Norway or Canada. We haven't been listening very carefully.
They say it's Norway or Canada. The British are probably going to ask for something that is neither, based on regulatory alignment. We'd be almost in the single market. We'd be aligned with EU rules, and if we changed our rules, we'd allow them to punish us a bit by removing market access. But Barnier is going to say no to that. We will at best get, I believe, what I'd call Canada Plus, which means Canada, as Ali's described, but with a bit more services added in, not single market, but some access in aviation, financial services, electricity, data flows, which matter. We'll have to pay a price, though. The price would be taking the rules from the EU, paying money into the budget, and taking something like the Court of Justice to tell us what to do.
Do you broadly agree with that assessment, Ali?
So I think actually when you look at what the Swiss model is, I think actually there is some wiggle room around. The Swiss aren't formal members of the single market, but they do have pretty good access in terms of goods. But really what we're talking about to really achieve that bespoke middle way option is some very deep, very unprecedented regulatory cooperation between the UK and the EU and a host of different regulatory bodies.
So it is right to say you can have your autonomy or you can have your access, but as far as you take a bit more of one, you lose a bit more of the
we
other.
can have our Canada Plus if we pay a price for it, which we may not wish to pay.
Great. Well, hang on there. Let's turn to the politicians, because with me in the studio is former Tory MP Peter Lilly, a Conservative, Brexiteer, but crucially a former President of the Board of Trade, so knows his way around these negotiations. And from Westminster, Labour's Chuka Umunna, who's chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on EU relations, and who'd really like us to remain within the single market and the customs union. Very good evening to you both. Peter, can you just rank, you would prefer Canada Plus Plus to Canada Plus to Canada. You could just rank the options for me.
Well, I prefer as few barriers as possible. It's in our interests, it's in Europe's interests. I don't think we will get the optimum, because the European Union has made it clear that they want us to appear, at least, to be worse off than we are at present. I find it difficult, because actually our exporters have got a 15% advantage because of the exchange rate. They'll have to pay 4% tariffs if there's no deal at all. So they'll, 15% outweighs 4% for most of them.
So you would prefer Canada Plus, you'd prefer Canada to nothing, WTO terms, the benchmark WTO terms, but you don't think they'll give it to us? Because the British government position is, they'll give it to us, it's in their interest.
Well, maybe they know something I don't know. I merely listen to what the European Union says and take them at their word. And taking at their word, we should be prepared for the probability that they won't get nearly as much as they are seeking, and that quite possibly will end up trading on WTO terms, which to my mind is a good second best. It's not as good.
It's not as good, but you're perfectly happy with it. Chuka, how much, can I ask how much of a disaster you think Canada would be? Just if we went straight to something very similar to Canada, not plus, but just Canada, how bad would that be from your perspective?
Well, I think it would be pretty disastrous. It may be appropriate for Canada, but we're the 6th biggest economy in the world and they're our biggest trading partner. And my preference would be the Norway option if we're to leave the European Union, which means we stay in the single market. At the very least, I'd like us to stay in the customs union too, but the government's chosen to do away with that, which is the best option. The problem with Canada, frankly, first of all, it took a long time to negotiate, around up to 7 years. Secondly, it doesn't cover services, really, and that's 80% of our economy. Thirdly, potentially, you could have foreign investors and large multinational companies suing the British government if they felt that we were not opening up the public sector, the NHS in particular, to further marketisation. And I don't think any of that is particularly attractive to the British people. It's just not appropriate for us. And of course, us having an FTA, Canada-style FTA, would preclude us staying in the free trade agreement. Yeah. It would preclude us from staying in the customs union. And of course, one of the parts of the agreement that was reached on Friday was that we should have a backstop position of being able to observe customs union and single market rules as a solution to the Northern Irish border
You've
problem.
said so much. I just want to let Peter Lilly respond to some of the arguments you've heard there about Canada.
Can I just knock on the head this idea that because the Canadian agreement took 8 years to negotiate, it would take a very long time for us to negotiate something similar. The Canadians started off with 10,000 different tariff lines. EU had 15,000 different tariff lines. They had first of all to decide how rapidly each of those could be traded off against the other. They started off with 20,000 different specifications for goods and services. They had to decide which were obstacles to trade and had to align them. We start off with 0 tariffs. We want to end up with 0 tariffs. That takes 10 minutes. Yeah. We start off with identical regulations.
So
we
it would
end
be
up
a big
with identical regulations.
All
we have to negotiate is a divergence mechanism.
Can I ask you, Chuka, do you think there's any possibility of a Norway option that would allow any restriction or any kind of change to the free movement rules? Because that, in many respects, is seen as the true red line of the British voters, isn't it? And that's where your Norway option falls, because they won't give you Norway but without free movement, Norway minus.
Well, let's not forget that free movement is a bit of a misleading phrase because it suggests that it's unconditional. Free movement is conditional. So there are things we can do within the existing free movement framework to better restrict immigration. So, for example, I mean, the Belgians require people to register when they come to their country and they've been there for more than 3 months. We don't require people to do that. In fact, we could require people, if they've been here for 3 months, haven't been able to get work and don't have the prospect of getting work, we can require them to leave, but we don't do that. Liechtenstein, which is has the Norway option, as it were, it's part of the European Free Trade Association, they actually have quotas that apply to the numbers of EU immigrants they have come to their country. So you can restrict it within the Norway framework, yes.
Charles Grant, can I just ask you, do you think there's a possibility of, if we're confronted with the sort of the starker choice, that they would say, look, you can have a Norway option, but with a little bit of concession on free movement?
One can fiddle with the margins of these details, like Chuka has said, but the broad principle is we would have to accept free movement. The EU believes the 4 freedoms of free movement of goods, services, people and capital are insolubly linked, and you can't have one without... You can't get rid of one without losing the others as well. That's an ideology for them.
Peter Lilly, for the last year, the government has sort of held the coalition of the Conservative Party together with this promise of a deep and special partnership, and one wonders if, as you suspect, that it isn't going to be on offer, that the kind of the middle route isn't going to be on offer. Is that going to be a difficult time for the Conservative Party, or do you think we'll just comfortably settle on Canada or WTO without...
This isn't about the Conservative Party, it's about Britain. Yeah. It will be better for Britain, as indeed for Europe, if we end up with something like the government's aiming for. If we don't, it will be because the EU don't want it, and therefore the way they'll engineer that is by saying you can have free trade, but on conditions that you won't be able to accept, like being subordinate to the European Court of Justice.
Or paying money, for example.
Or paying money, or accepting
And you
free
wouldn't
movement
accept
of
any of
labour.
that, paying
well,
money?
It will be some combination of those three. And the British people voted against those. So we couldn't. Right. It would be going back, as Mrs May said in the opening remark, it would be going back on Brexit.
We're going to leave it there, but I dare say we'll be coming back to it in the future. Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks.
Down the bottom here you want to go, don't you? May accepts demands for greater scrutiny of Brexit laws. Who chose this, Kevin?
Yeah, it is over the Henry VIII power she's going to take him, and she shouldn't have anything to fear about greater scrutiny in Parliament. One of the Brexit drivers, along with, it's got to be said, controls on migration, the £350 million a week extra for the NHS doesn't exist, was also take back control, sovereignty of Parliament. And if Parliament is sovereign, it should be able to scrutinise everything very closely and take decisions, and that includes her, Queen, the May Queen, taking Henry VIII powers as she tries to repatriate laws, put European laws in.
And so what she said
in the British legislation,
in the spirit of compromise, which we saw, of course, in Brussels last week, that Parliament would be more involved. But I do have to say, most of these wretched laws that we're converting from Brussels into British law were passed by the Houses of Parliament,
health and safety, consumer protection, environmental control.
No debate on no vote.
No scrutiny whatsoever. They just nodded it all through. So if she'd done the same, there could hardly be any criticism of it, because it became law without any scrutiny. Now there is going to be more scrutiny.
Yeah, your Tory ministers will have probably agreed, some of them, as in the Council of Ministers together.
Meanwhile, happy days from the Commons today. May Britain has taken a big step on our EU mission. This is the Express.
So Bodicea now, she's gone from being...
You know what happened to her?
Yeah, well, she did all right. Yeah, I see she did all right for a while. She, of course, who could have made it up? This time last week, she was... it was about as bad as it could be for Mrs May, humiliated in Brussels, came back with her tail between her legs. She's pulled off that deal on Friday, Lazarus-like, back from the grave, back from the tomb. And she was congratulated in the Commons today by Ken Clarke, the Ramona-in-Chief, Anna Soubry, the second Ramona-in-Chief, and Ian Duncan-Smith on the other side of the argument. So she's pulled off quite a feat, in that she's united the parliamentary party, and his lot are now going on about easy movement of labour as opposed to free movement of people. Easy movement, another new concept, another U-turn. How many U-turns? I think there have been 94 in the last 6 months.
You've made that figure up.
No, I haven't.
But 39 billion pounds you back when you originally said
compromise,
nothing.
Then you said it would be
works so well. More than 20 billion.
Compromise.
But the Conservatives are the first to demand flexibility in the workforce, aren't they? And if that means easy movement of labour from European countries to prop up some of our national services, then you might accept that.
Hang on. Free movement has been an underpinning, has been a central tenet of the EU for decades.
It's one of the 4 pillars.
Where did easy movement come from?
Yeah, but what
are we talking about? Are they having laxative chocolates or something? I mean, what on earth? Easy movement? What?
Kevin.
What does it mean?
What do you mean?
What does it mean? He doesn't know. And did you hear
You've just had a verbal bowel movement.
Look, you haven't
Did you hear that challenged woman on the Brent MP on the Daily Politics programme today, trying to explain what easy movement meant?
Dawn Butler.
Car crash.
What I mean is not something. Whatever the system is, it's not overly bureaucratic. But
they're making it up as they go along, Labour, all over the place.
You watch what his mob do.
All over the place.
And they will go for easy movement or some restrictions on free movement. And of course, it's not total free movement now. We have migration controls with 95% of the world,
all
not
over
in the European Union. And then within, if you come here and you haven't got a job with 3 months, you could be deported. You could stop rapists and murderers
Anna's eyes
coming
closing.
in.
She's beginning to fall asleep.
There's only so much Brexit excitement I can take.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Particularly from Kevin.
You just don't like facts.
I might wait to see what the end result is.
You just don't like facts.
We've moved on.
You don't like facts.
No, we don't. But they're not facts because we don't know what the end result is going to be.
No, but we know what the position is.
No, don't, Anna. You're going to start him off again.
No, okay, right.